some populations are less valued based on their color, so are their communities, their lives, and their cultures devalued. Where they live, work, play, and learn is devalued and ripe for exploitation and degradation by the dominant society. We know that Black communities are disproportionately impacted by pollution and the cumulative impact of exposure to multiple polluting facilities in their communities, which are more vulnerable to extreme heat, climate change, and extreme weather. These communities also lack access to clean air and water, healthy homes and schools, and sustainable, safe communities. Now, this environmental justice crisis really results from a complex legacy of housing segregation, land use and zoning discrimination, and inequitable environmental law enforcement. And systemic and institutional environmental injustice results in the disproportionate exposures to environmental hazards and polluting facilities, which has really contributed to health disparities and shortened lifespans. And we know that there's growing evidence that this is no coincidence. In the early 20th century, as your exhibit certainly shows, local and federal officials, usually white, enacted policies that reinforced racial segregation in cities and diverted investment away from minority neighborhoods in ways that created large disparities in the urban environment and the urban heat environment. We're feeling those consequences today. I mean, back in the 1930s, the federal government created maps of hundreds of cities, rating the riskiness of different neighborhoods for real estate investment by giving them grades. And so Black and immigrant neighborhoods were typically rated hazardous, outlined in red, to imply that they were not a suitable place to lend money. So for decades, people in red line areas were denied access to federally backed mortgages and other credit, which of course sparked a whole entire cycle of divestment and disinvestment. And the New York Times recently reported on a study that found that formerly red line neighborhoods are today 5 degrees hotter in summer on average than areas that were once favored for housing loans, with some cities seeing differences as large as 12 degrees. So red line neighborhoods, which remained lower income and more likely to have Black or Latino residents, those neighborhoods consistently have far fewer trees and parks that help cool the air. They also have more paved surfaces, such as asphalt lots, nearby highways that absorb and radiate heat. And every Black neighborhood, no matter its income level, was outlined in red and deemed a hazardous area for housing loans. And the appraiser's notes always made clear that race was a key factor in giving those neighborhoods the lowest grade. Now, many cities, they were already segregated before the 30s by racial zoning laws and restrictive covenants that barred Black families from moving into white neighborhoods. But the redlining maps, they deepened the patterns of racial inequality in ways that have lasted for decades. And white families could more easily get loans and federal assistance to buy homes, building wealth to pass on to their kids. And Black families all too often could not. And so when Black soldiers returned home from World War II, there was a GI Bill, and it sent waves of white soldiers to college and gave subsidized mortgages to white soldiers, but Black soldiers had no access to those benefits. So again, we see that this kind of bias has been systemic and also government sanctioned. So neighborhoods with white homeowners had more clout to lobby city governments for tree-lined sidewalks and parks, and in Black neighborhoods, homeownership declined and landlords rarely invested in green space. And city planners also targeted redlined areas as cheap land for new industries, highways, warehouses, and public housing, of course, built with lots of heat absorbing asphalt and little cooling vegetation. So disparities in access to housing finance really created a snowball effect that compounded over generations and Congress did outlaw redlining by the 1970s, but the practice has left lasting marks on cities. Even today, cities don't consider racial equity when they develop environmental plans, climate plans, which really means that climate protection measures, like green roofs on buildings, often disproportionately benefit whiter, wealthier residents. But that's slowly starting to change. For instance, in Houston, officials recently passed an ordinance to prioritize disadvantaged neighborhoods for flood protection. But, we all understand that the communities of color and indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable to climate change because those communities are generally the first and worst hit by extreme weather events that exacerbate the legacy of pollution and environmental degradation in their communities. And those events really expose the lack of financial and family resources to be resilient in the face of such adversity. But meanwhile, these communities also are lacking access to clean air and water, healthy homes and schools, sustainable neighborhoods. So that the environmental justice vision places human health at the center of environmental struggles, because we know that our physical environment and the zip code in which we live is an important determinant of our health. Today, Black communities, Indigenous areas, Latino communities are not created equal. They're impacted by disproportionate and cumulative exposures, which put African Americans, Latinos, and Indigenous peoples and Asian Americans at higher risk of mortality and morbidity from a host of chronic disease. And we understand that government has done little to correct this situation, and inequitable environmental enforcement has also exacerbated the problems. So how is this actually experienced around the country? Well, communities experience environmental degradation in diverse ways, depending on the region. In Alaska, Indigenous people are relocating from the ocean front as rising seas compromise their homes and hunting grounds. In California and Texas, where there are very few zoning laws, industrial facilities like oil refineries and cement facilities are allowed to be fence lined with your backyard. In Louisiana's Cancer Alley, chemical and oil refineries have exceedances of emissions and fires right next door to homes where there are no escape routes and there's very little enforcement. In the Southeast, people live in rural areas fence line to combined animal feed operations. They're called CAFOs. And these contaminate the soil and groundwater during extreme wet weather events and in communities where most people are on well water. And so we also see in places like Mobile, Alabama, an historic community called Africatown has 5 industrial facilities that release nearly 1 million pounds of air toxins, according to the toxic release inventory. And in New York, the mobile source pollution has created disparate levels of African Americans dying from COVID. Now, today, though, the national average of air pollution has decreased, and many of us have thought that was a victory. However, we see that 71% of African Americans in this country live in non-attainment areas for clean air standards, and 80% of Latinos do. Now, the 1986 Toxic Waste and Race Study documented that the prime predictor of where a toxic waste site is primarily located is in a community of color and secondarily a low-income community. Now, these issues are all interrelated, and they cannot be addressed in our silos and in isolation. And I believe that the country and the social justice community is now awakening to that reality as well. And we now see that the Biden administration is also committed to trying to change that reality. But where we live, work, play, and go to school, That's the way the environmental justice movement has redefined the environment. And some of those dynamics have been captured when you think about the built environment, where children run along sidewalks and hallways of urban and rural America, inhaling diesel pollutants, fine particles, and environmental tobacco smoke, which combine to decrease their birth weight, which exposes them to learning problems and developmental delays. Sensitized in utero to multiple indoor pest allergens, these children may have an increased risk of asthma. And we understand that children in their early stages of development are more vulnerable to environmental exposures, and that children of color living in communities of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution, and they have the most disadvantage. But all kinds of children breathe in diesel fumes while sitting inside that yellow school bus on their way to schools heated by coal-fired furnaces that spew articles and greenhouse gases. They splash water from the polluted water fountain that should have been shut down in their school years ago, and they wheeze from toxic cleaning products and pesticides applied in their classrooms without notification. They play blocks and video games as they cavort around the floor of their bedrooms. They ingest lead dust from the old peeling paint in their closet that lands on their doll baby or their rattle that fell to the floor. Why can't they learn? Will an intervention help them to learn in school, obey simple requests, or hold down a job once they've been lead poisoned? And the lack of food security in their communities means they may eat more chicken nuggets than fresh fruits and veggies and put on an excess weight that places them by 2 years of age at risk for asthma by age 5, according to the Columbia Children's Center for Environmental Health. Now, their parents may be Asian or Native American descent and bring home dinner caught in the nearby river, fish laden with mercury and PCBs, a real danger to their adolescent siblings or their pregnant mother. Their father may unknowingly come from work bringing home lead or asbestos dust on his clothing, and the immigrant child may suck on a new bracelet or a piece of candy bought from a neighborhood convenience store that contains lead or mercury. The most vulnerable at-risk populations in this country are children, especially those living in communities of color. But it took me a while to become aware of these dynamics. When I look back at my high school and college days, I was really certain of the path that I would take to fulfill my dreams. You know, I was an English major at Howard University, and since high school, I had dreamed of becoming a journalist and a magazine editor. And my first job was as a reporter at the Indianapolis News. It was a major daily newspaper in Indianapolis where I was the first Black reporter on the women's page in the 70s. And it was the best job I've ever had. But I was a little too ambitious to stay longer than 2 years, and I should have, to refine my skills more. But looking back, that was a mistake if you really want to achieve a newspaper career in New York City. But with a journalism award under my belt, I headed for New York to work as a researcher for Time Out Books. And within a year, I was the freelance home editor of Essence Magazine, which had just gotten started. And so you might be wondering, well, if you were a magazine editor, how did you get to be working in the environmental struggle? And so I value that all people have the right to clean air, to clean water, food security, and a toxic-free future. And there's just compelling evidence that we're all exposed, whether it's at home, at school, in our communities, at toxins and allergens that can have lifelong and intergenerational effects on our public health, our reproductive outcomes, human development, and the sustainability of the planet. So when I started, I just wasn't aware of these dynamics. I began as a political activist running for election as a Democratic Party district leader. organizing in Harlem, in West Harlem in the 80s. I had come to New York, though I'd grown up in Washington, D.C. and Trenton, New Jersey, with the vision of being an editor. And I began to use my writing skills in political campaigns, and really began to think about having a more substantive career change, and began working as a speechwriter in a state government agency. And my journalism skills led me toward electoral politics and community organizing. I began working in the New York City campaign of Jesse Jackson in his first campaign for president. And I became the public relations director for the Manhattan campaign, and it was exciting and set me on a path that really changed my life, my career, my aspirations. And through that campaign, I really gained an important political mentor, Bill Lynch. I interacted with key leaders around the state, and I had the opportunity to gauge the disparity between communities in regard to the distribution of benefits and burdens. So under the banner of Leadership for a Change, I ran as an insurgent and was elected female Democratic district leader in Harlem. And it was a community with strong political figures that not even the community organizers at Acorn or Reverend Al Sharpton at that time ran organizing activities in Harlem. And it was a trio of older female senior citizens who provided my insurgency and my leadership position with a real energized base of support. And they really became my community-based political mentors. They told me it was my generational turn to take over the organizing and community education that was necessary to improve West Harlem's quality of life. And that effort to grow new progressive political leadership in West Harlem became the foundation of the struggle for environmental justice in Northern Manhattan. And so through strong organizing efforts, we got the city to commit $55 million to fix the North River plant, which was spewing odors and emissions that were making people sick. And we received a $1.1 million settlement of our lawsuit against the city. And 18 years of advocacy, you've got to be in this for the long haul, folks. 18 years of advocacy have made the MTA diesel bus fleet one of the cleanest in the nation. And there are many other victories in communities that have been made the dumping grounds for polluting facilities. And so, also when I first began organizing around these issues, I recognized the lack of scientific literacy, information, data, context was and really continues to be a serious void that contributes to the systemic exclusion of communities of color and low income from decision making that affects their families and their communities. Science and technology are important tools that can have great impact on our ability to develop safe, sustainable communities. And around the nation, environmental justice advocates have realized that evidence-based campaigns move policymakers and empower residents. Now, what are the challenges communities face? They face such a number of challenges, and they often have few allies in doing so. Certainly, there are national green groups that provide some legal help, but that does not address the thousands of cases that need to be addressed. Communities need legal support and technical support to analyze and respond to, say, a 1,000-page environmental impact statement in 30 to 45 days, because that's the way large environmental projects are often rolled out, through a large environmental impact statement of thousands of pages produced over a year period of time by engineers, and suddenly a community has 30 to 45 days to assess and analyze that and to better understand how this project is going to have an impact on their community and their lives. These communities need the same sort of access to regulators as industry has, instead of simply getting 3 minutes to testify at a public hearing, even if one is held. And even when we understand the permitting process, regulators are biased to industry and assume community members are exaggerating the conditions. And the idea of reopening discussions on a permit renewal is non-negotiable. And I know because the New York State Environmental Justice Advisory Board here has tried to do that. Now, our communities also need policymakers and legislators who understand these issues so they can be allies. But most legislators are clueless on the link between environmental exposures and chronic disease. In New York, it took me a couple of years, but I was able to get the Natural Resources Defense Council to help me sue the city on the North River plant, which resulted in the city committing that $50 million to fix that brand new plant in the Hudson River. And I know how important organizing is, but I know some activists in the South whose jobs were threatened if they kept speaking out against large infrastructure projects. And in some communities, racism plays out in such a deadly way. In Tennessee, the white farmers were told by the city not to use well water, which was contaminated, but directly across the road, the Black families were not informed, and they have had generations of family members dying from cancer. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund won that case for them, but not after generations had died. Now, during our current upheaval of racial consciousness, many national green groups have issued statements of solidarity, but as we know, actions speak louder than words. So a first principle would be do no harm, which does not mean do nothing. And so going beyond the obvious of diversifying boards and staffs of green groups, important commissions, advisory bodies, we've got to consider how to integrate an environmental justice analysis into all of our work and programming, how to train staff on how to do that, and how and why it's central to the mission of improving environmental quality in this country, and on being culturally and linguistically competent. Staff don't often in agencies have a knowledge base of how bias plays out or about environmental exposures on health, or that environmental quality is a key social determinant of health. So we do need a culture shift, and we're beginning to scratch the surface. Whether you're working on conservation or open space or fisheries or oceans, there are affected groups of diverse populations who will be affected directly or indirectly by the policy or practice you seek to implement. And as students, as you're working in classrooms and thinking about policy and how to administer key projects, again, you have to continue to think about the diversity of perspectives and to bring those into the creation of the projects that you're working on. And procedurally, you just need to hear from the people who are going to be most affected by the action that you take. And of course, that means really understanding and assessing the full ramifications of a policy. And in that way, you can begin to get buy-in and develop allies and partners in creating the policies that we need. It's not good enough to basically lower the overall rate of pollution or burden without considering and addressing the distributional issue, distributional justice. So I would say national groups and academics have the technical knowledge that's needed to develop evidence-based campaigns at the grassroots. And at my organization, we have been successful with our partnerships at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, where my organization is contracted to translate their community-based environmental health research into public education and policy at the city, state, and national level. And even when regulators understand the permitting process and the community understands that process, we understand that regulators are often biased toward industry and assume community members are exaggerating. But again, we can overcome some of these issues by having data, evidence, strong allies who are working with communities to influence policy and to educate our elected officials. Now, for the past 22 years or so, WEACT has served as a community partner of the Columbia Center for at the Columbia Center for Basic Research Science in Environmental Health. And the center is called the NIEHS Center for Environmental Health in Northern Manhattan. And we've engaged in community-based participatory research to answer community questions regarding environmental exposures from a number of point sources of pollution. And we've engaged in research that has identified environmental exposures of mothers and children in Harlem, Washington Heights, and the South Bronx. Again, the goal is to improve environmental policy and impact public health. So my vision and agenda for the coming decade places communities at the center of dialogue, planning, action, and change. There is an urgent need to apply what we know to the policy arena by educating, training, and empowering community members to mobilize around environmental issues so they can better protect their children from dangerous exposures, so they can play an active role in larger coordinated efforts to change policies that will help improve environmental conditions, such as regulatory actions, standard setting, and improved affordable housing conditions. So again, WEACT began in the late 80s in West Harlem. I became a delegate to the first People of Color Environmental Justice Summit in 1991, where we developed the 17 principles of the environmental justice. And I welcome you all to go and Google those 17 principles and find out how current they are. 30 years ago, we developed those and how current they are today. And it will give you a strong sense of the values and principles of the movement. And it will really describe how environmental justice communities place human health at the center of environmental struggles because our physical environment and zip code is such an important determinant of health. So our strategy at WEACT and our theory of change is that we can build healthy communities by organizing and engaging effective community residents in environmental decision-making through organizing, membership, leadership training, community-based research, advocacy, policy development, and movement building. And so to help build movement capacity, WEACT opened a federal policy office in Washington, D.C. 9 years ago to really elevate the voices and perspectives of frontline communities of color in Congress and at federal agencies. And so our D.C. office coordinates a network that we started 10 years ago of over 50 environmental justice groups nationally across 24 states called the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum. Now, today in New York, mobile source pollution has created disparate levels of African Americans dying from COVID. And today, again, though the national average of air pollution has decreased, we still see that air pollution in communities of color have increased their risk of dying from COVID, according to a Harvard study last year. So as a result, WEACT has really focused on community-based research on air quality and toxics with our Columbia School of Public Health partners. And that has been just a very valuable partnership that has really helped us to develop the data and the evidence to support more protective policies for our children and our families. At the city council level, we were able to pass the toughest lead poisoning law in the country with a citywide coalition of our peers, and also an asthma-free homes bill that mandates landlords to correct indoor allergen hazards in the homes of residents that have been diagnosed with asthma. And then last year, we worked to achieve 2 environmental justice laws, one that created a New York City study of environmental justice communities, which is now just getting underway, and an Environmental Justice Advisory Council and a New York City interagency task force to develop a plan from the study they conduct, a plan to address environmental justice concerns and conditions. So that is a lot of good news. I have the opportunity to chair that New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board, and we certainly hope to shine a light on the conditions so many are living in our communities and be a part of developing a plan to address those challenges. So whether we have been involved in creating the West Harlem Pierce Park, which is just a short walk from the Barnett campus, right on the Hudson River, we developed that with hundreds of residents, developing an action plan and to getting the city to develop that. We've also pulled over 400 community residents together to develop a Northern Manhattan climate action plan so that we can really focus on climate resilience, energy democracy, and really fuel the installation of solar on so many of the roofs of affordable housing so that we can fight gentrification by keeping housing more affordable. So community-based planning for climate resilience is so important to our communities. And I believe every community should be developing a climate resilience plan. We also have an environmental health leadership and training program that we run every year for adults. We can train community residents and leaders, as well as public school students in over 32 climate and environmental topics. And right now we run the training in a public school for 7th to 12th graders every semester for 1 week, where we train 90 students and advise them on projects that they develop based on the environmental curriculum that they've been learning. And so as we really face and confront the climate crisis, which is one of the most challenging crises most of us will confront in our lifetimes, we understand that the mainstream climate movement has been missing the voices and perspectives of the people most affected by extreme weather. But this is beginning to change as well. A year ago, I was part of developing something called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. Actually, it was 3 years ago now. And it was authored by a platform authored by 12 environmental justice organizations and 6 mainstream green organizations, including Sierra Club, NRDC, Earth Justice, Union of Concerned Scientists, League of Conservation Voters, and the Center for American Progress. And it's a platform where we were able to come together around a consensus that advanced the goals of economic, racial, climate, and environmental justice to improve the public health and the well-being of all communities while tackling the climate crisis. Because, you know, we really can do that together. We can come together in a consensus around how to address the challenge and also ensure that the people most affected have well-being and are part of developing the solutions. So I would just ask you to think about the many ways you can address racial injustice and environmental injustice. You can start out by doing the research and dispel the myth of jobs versus the environment. There is not a correlation there. Let's refuse to make plans or decisions that don't include all of the stakeholders and representatives of the people most affected negatively by the plan or initiative that you're undertaking. And understand that people of color can speak for themselves and should be consulted. Then support grassroots groups in all of our neighborhoods around the city and the country that are doing the racial and environmental justice work And you can do that through funding, through equipment, through technical assistance, through being a fellow or an intern or a volunteer. And also think about developing partnerships with untraditional allies. We just partnered with the Fordham Law School to help us research legal and regulatory strategies. We've worked with the Columbia Business School to help us develop a plan for certain kinds of economic development opportunities. We've worked with the Transit Workers Union to understand and take action on the environmental exposures of workers and residents in our subways. And we've worked with the Columbia Earth Institute to develop a report on congestion pricing. Also, remember that experts can be found in so many places, and most of them do not have an advanced degree. People who are affected should be sought after for their expertise on these conditions. And also that true collaboration means developing a process where all stakeholders can participate in developing the concept, the initiative, or intervention from day one. There is strength in a process that has buy-in from all parties. And of course, we've got to walk the talk. We understand the lessons of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy. We must fight for climate justice here and abroad, and we can all join that fight by letting our local, state, and federal officials know that we understand the challenges of global warming and the burdens that will be inflicted on communities of color and low income here and abroad. And we must let them know that they've got to take action to reduce the human contribution to global warming that can wreck the social fabric and infrastructure of our communities, as it has done in New Orleans and many island states of the world where Indigenous people make their home. We can all take actions to reduce the footprint of our consumption. And just please remember, it takes a symphony of allies to make the change we need, not simply the change each of us wants, but the change we all need. And as John Lewis said, if you see something wrong, stand up, say something, do something, get into good trouble. So thank you for inviting me today, and thank you for listening. And I hope you all will take action.
Thank you so much for that inspirational talk, Peggy, and for giving us so much to think about. You said that I took away some of your talk with the introduction. You took away a lot of my questions. But I on a personal note, first of all, I'd like to invite others to submit questions. You can do that in the Q&A. There are folks behind the scenes who will help us keep track of those. And there is also a chat, but you can use the Q&A to have your question seen and answered. But something that I'm thinking about as a parent who's raised children in the Bronx, how hyper-local these issues are. And you talked about that it's not good enough for us to seek national improvements, for example, or big improvements that don't really deal with the distributional justice issues. So my personal experience is having a child almost lost to an asthma attack, and realizing in that process that we lived near a place where buses parked. And in order to manage my child's health, I would have to basically seal off my apartment. That kind of thing becomes something that, I think a lot of parents, it can shift their lives, and I'm sure you've seen this with people who are part of your membership. Yeah. I guess my question is about how this is part of the disproportionate impact on people of color. the spaces that we live in being unsafe spaces, which you obviously outlined for us. What are some of the ways that you help people break through the enormity of that? The fact that they have to deal with that at home, and it is also a policy issue.
Well, when you begin to engage with the people who are most affected by the issue, they often have been struggling with that challenge for months and years with no respite. So they're very happy to tell you their story, to tell you their circumstance, because they are seeking allies and they need assistance. And so to be able to tell your story to the elected officials, to the media, and then to begin to understand the policies that are keeping you in that condition, or understand the policies that could alleviate that condition. Once people begin to understand those options, they are very engaged in wanting to be a part of that solution. And so, do we talk to people about indoor air quality issues, the repairs that need to be made in housing? We work with a lot of members and residents who live in public housing, where there are mold issues, lead issues, water intrusion issues, and extreme heat issues in the summer, because over 50% of NYCHA residents do not have air conditioning. And we know that our planet and our city is getting hotter each year because of climate change dynamics. And we also know, as we just talked about, and your exhibit also documents, that often the more segregated communities, where the red line communities, are the communities that have greater heat exposure. Fewer trees. We had a 1 million tree program under Mayor Bloomberg, and all of those trees did not get to where they needed to get, because I can walk down a number of streets a few blocks from my house. I can walk down 135th Street, there's no tree. And East Harlem has a very serious extreme heat situation because of its built environment. And so, again, helping people understand the impact of those issues, because they're already experiencing it on themselves. Often they think they're the only ones. And often we don't understand that what you just discussed, living near a bus depot and having a child with asthma, we spent 18 years working to get these bus depots safer. And how do we do that? By having the buses that are cleaner. So getting hybrid buses. Now we're talking about electric buses, and there are a few electric buses. But again, that's been an 18 to 20 year trajectory of impacting public policy. And of course, when you talk about transportation, you're talking about vehicles like a bus that have a 12 to 16 year life. So that once they're on the road, you're not going to simply say, well, diesel buses are bad, let me take it off. You're going to wait until those buses have ended their value, their life. And so we still continue to see some of those diesel buses on the road. And we have really worked with the MTA to ensure that every single bus in New York City is now cleaner. And so now we've got to move on towards electrification, and also electrification of school buses, which is a large coalition in New York City, really focused on the school bus issue.
Thank you. There are some really great questions in our Q&A. Teresa asks, what grassroots groups have you noted or would recommend for individuals looking to get involved in environmental justice?
Well, I would start with We Act, which is just a few blocks from the college. We certainly have a range of issues, and of course, we're already working with some Barnard students. Some Barnard students have been working for the past 2 years with some of my policy team at We Act, and so that's been a great partnership as well. But there are groups, they're housing-oriented groups down on the Lower East Side, like Goals. There are other smaller housing groups throughout the community. There's the Morningside Park Alliance that, is focused on keeping a safe park and good programming that's equitable and inclusive. So there are parks groups all over Harlem. There are transit groups. There are running clubs. So there are a lot of ways to get involved. And of course, in other boroughs, you have the Point. You have South Bronx Unite up in the Bronx. You have Uprose out in Sunset Park. There are groups in Far Rockaway now and in Red Hook who are really working on climate resilience. So I'm sure Google's still your friend, and you can do a lot of research that way.
Well, that relates to a question that I have, though. Do you feel like there are specific peers or allies nationally that you would like to highlight for us? As a person of color who was part of this group, that you mentioned, meeting 30 years ago, that was one of the questions you stole from us, about the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, who were visionary in thinking about how equitable climate change activism needed to happen. Who do you think on a national scale we should be looking at and following?
Oh, there are so many organizations. There's the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice in New Orleans. Wonderful group working in Cancer Alley and working on climate resilience in Louisiana and throughout the Gulf Coast. There's the Communities for Better Environment, CBE, out in LA and Oakland. There's the Asian Pacific Islander, it's called APIN, Asian Pacific Islander Environmental Network in Oakland. And they often have an office in Richmond, California. There's the Green Door Initiative in Detroit. There's the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance out of Newark. There's the Ironbound Corporation in Newark. So there are groups throughout the South. The Land Loss Project in North Carolina, in Raleigh. So there's so many organizations all over the country, as well as the Indigenous Environmental Network in Bemidji, Minnesota. And there are hundreds of groups. Those are some of the ones that I work with most often, and certainly do great work.
Thank you. My colleague Mary has been putting these links in the chat, and we will share these out with our listserv as well. So an anonymous attendee is asking, what impacts, if any, do you think the passing of ballot proposal 2, right to clean air, clean water, and healthful environment that we just passed in New York State will have? It's been described as quote unquote toothless, without clear funding or concrete steps.
Well, I think there's a lot of pros and cons that I've heard expressed about that particular resolution that's been passed by the voters. Some people feel that it will lead to an incredible amount of litigation around environmental rights. That could be troubling, but it could also be empowering. It could also raise the visibility of so many concerns around environmental human rights. On the other hand, it could keep things tied up in court for years so that we can't move ahead on certain environmental policies that could be very helpful. So there are opinions on both sides of that, and I guess we'll have to wait and see.
That relates to a question that I have about reparations and just the question around your experiences with justice coming through the awarding of settlements or financial decisions. And we recently saw money being awarded in the case of Flint, where many people, thousands of people were impacted by being exposed to lead in their water. As you talked about, this kind of harm is going to be multi-generational, is already multi-generational, and in the life of a single person, early exposure can really set the course of one's life before they even have the chance to make their own decisions. So how does financial compensation work as a form of justice in your mind? And do you have other preferred strategies or goals?
Well, this country lives on subsidies and reparations, and they're just called tax credits. They're called incentives. They're called contracts sometimes. So we get caught up in certain words like the word reparations, and there's a knee-jerk reaction to that word. But in essence, we are giving tax incentives to corporations every day. We're giving credits to companies every day, still in the oil and gas industry. And that's a key issue with the Biden administration, that on one hand, you say, we want Justice 40 funds to go to frontline communities because they've been so underinvested in, and we want to transform to a renewable energy future, but we're still going to help subsidize some of the fossil fuel industry. So again, when we see Trump give tax breaks to millionaires, that's a form of reparation. So do I think that the Black community deserves supports for the intergenerational challenges that we've had to endure? Yes, I do. Do I think that affirmative action was a good vehicle for better inclusion of Black and Latinos in our society? Yes, I do. I would never have gotten a job at Time Life if there hadn't been a plan that said we want to open up and welcome diverse people. So I think those programs that address the issues of people who have been locked out are very, very important. As I mentioned, there was a GI Bill, and white soldiers came back and they built wealth. I mean, Black soldiers went to Harvard and Yale on the GI Bill. I mean, white soldiers, Harvard and Yale on the GI Bill. They bought houses and homes for their families. And the Black soldiers returning did not have access to that, even though the bill legally should have applied to them. But the government, again, systemic issues, the government did not apply that government initiative equally and equitably. And so, yes, there's a lot of discussion about reparations. Native Americans are looking for reparations as well, and deserve that. But we haven't had the dialogue in this country that, for instance, they've had in South Africa, that they've had in Germany, where you've had public dialogues around these horrendous occurrences that have happened in these countries. And we have not gone through that reconciliation. And I'm not sure that true reparations in the name called reparations can happen without that reconciliation.
Thank you. Yes. My own question is about whether it's ever enough, right? If there is it really enough of a disincentive to stop doing the things that have led to this. If money can be something that is just an easy transitional form of justice without the real change that we're seeking. But of course, it's deserved. And we have another question here. Considering the ongoing cases identifying lead and mold in NYCHA homes, alongside the local federal level policies attempting to dismantle Section 9, privatize management, and manipulate land use for banks and private development, how do you envision racial, environmental, economic justice possibilities for NYCHA residents?
Well, we've been working with NYCHA residents to develop their agenda in Northern Manhattan and to try to ensure that all of the candidates who've run for city and state office have understood the position and the perspectives of those NYCHA residents. We continue to work with residents around the concept of the RAD and other kinds of the blueprint. These are concepts that have been discussed and initiated in order to provide more, supposedly to provide more funding for repairs at NYCHA, since the federal government had cut back on funds to NYCHA and the city and state have not been providing enough funds to support the kinds of repairs that are needed in NYCHA. So we're committed to continuing to work with NYCHA residents. We now have had a major transition at the city and state level and at the federal level. And so there's a new discussion that has to be had. And we're certainly, as co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the members of that council have certainly been pushing and advocating for HUD to provide more funding to big city public housing. And certainly WEACT has been very vocal in advocating at HUD for money to come to NYCHA here in New York. Did that fully answer the question? I'm not sure if there was another part to that question.
It seemed like the question was about privatization overall.
Yeah, there are opinions on both sides. There's some tenants that want privatization and feel that that their apartments will be renovated and better maintained, and there are others who see it as a way to evict people and who would not have a right to return. So there are very differing perspectives on that issue. But I think most tenants are not for the blueprint and not for privatization.
So how have you learned to endure? I hate to put this in a negative way, but you've talked about some very long struggles. You've talked about working on a single campaign for 18 years, alongside obviously many other exciting campaigns and hopefully victories. What's your advice for people about dealing with the long game of systemic change?
Well, my advice is that you have to be an optimist. You have to be in it for the long haul, that policy change can be surprisingly, if you have the right political window of opportunity, something can happen in a year. And if you don't have that window of opportunity, it could take 20 or perhaps never happen. So, so much is about creating that window of opportunity through organizing and mobilization, communication, developing policies that you think could be more protective of our communities. And a lot of it will be electing the right people to our legislatures, whether they're local, state, or federal. And you just can't put a pin on that. You've got to elect people who support the kinds of things that you support as a voter, if we're going to have the kinds of policies that we need.
Another thing I've heard you talk about is assumptions, and the assumptions that are kind of underpinning the system that we've been addressing, where we're talking about people profiting from segmenting and basically containing harm into certain places, right? And how those assumptions maybe also can be undermining when we're allied with people who also seem to want the same thing. That if we're all fighting for systemic change, but we actually don't know or don't agree to certain principles or certain values, or we don't necessarily recognize the intentionality or the problematic aspects of the American kind of dream or sort of democratic ideal. What are some of the assumptions that you are fighting against, and what are some assumptions that you wish we had collectively when we talk about thinking about, I guess, undesigning, right, the system? Maybe it starts with a new set of assumptions. What would those be?
I think one assumption, in fact, is that the people with lived experience need to be part of the solution from the very beginning. I think the whole jobs versus the environment paradigm has always been a false assumption. I think that the assumption that people in communities don't know what they're talking about, don't know what's good for them, is a wrong assumption. The assumption that organizations run by people of color and Black women cannot be effective and transformative is a bad assumption. So, the fact that Black people are scary is a bad assumption, or all of those other stereotypes. So we can go on and on, whether it's about LGBTQ folks, whether it's about people of color or indigenous. There are assumptions that are holding us back. There are assumptions that are holding us back from coming together, being allies. There are assumptions going on right now in Congress about people of color taking over this country that will not allow people who have very little means, will not allow them to support the kinds of projects and programs they need to sustain their families. And it's all based on a group of false assumptions that are keeping everyone down. The people who have the false assumptions, as well as the ones who are the victim of that.
Thanks. Yes.
And the other false assumption is that things are so hard to do or things are so big that they can't be addressed, that one of us just can't take it on. And that's a false assumption because one person can make a difference.
I love that. That's a very hopeful note.
And we see it every day, and just open our eyes and our arms to it. But it's there every day, that people are standing up and making a difference. And we can all do that.
In your intro, I erroneously said that the Build Back Better bill had passed because it passed the House, but obviously there's still a huge struggle ahead. And some of the assumptions that you mentioned are really at the core of that struggle, and why certain things have not progressed in our legislative process. I wonder if you could give us an outlook from the rest of this year, if there's your top three things that you hope to see realized this year, and that you think we should put our energy behind to support.
Well, a very strong voting rights bill I would like to see. A reconciliation bill that retains family leave and some of the family sustaining aspects of that bill. And I'd like to see the Justice 40 initiative, which can be sending billions to frontline communities in this country. I want to see that gets sent to the communities to which it's intended.
What will that look like in Harlem?
Great question. What would that look like? That would look like money's coming in to provide microgrids, energy security, more solar installations that can help provide, can help in terms of addressing energy insecurity. We have so many energy insecure households in this country. Money's going to LIHEAP, not only to support heat in the winter for vulnerable families, but also to provide cooling in the summer, because over 50% of the people who die in New York City from extreme heat are Black New Yorkers. So there's so many things that we can see. East Harlem needs parks. We need trees all over our community to improve air quality and provide the shade as the extreme heat continues. There's so many issues. Pedestrian plazas, so that we can really have more of a sense of of community, and not, be constantly, victim to cars and even bikes. The bikes on the street, the bikes everywhere trying to knock you down. I'm Bike paths are good. I don't mean that, but everyone doesn't follow the rules. But yes, I mean, there's so many planning tools and new construction that can really make a difference in our communities. And so I want to see some of those Justice 40 monies. I want to see money coming in to help underemployed folks gain new skills, but not only new skills, but have a pipeline to a job. And seeing that money can come to community colleges and HBCUs and minority serving institutions, so that we can get our folks transitioned into a new economy. Apparently, the majority of fossil fuel workers are people of color. And so when we talk about a just transition to a renewable economy, we're talking about a lot of those folks, including underemployed people of color. But a lot of the people we have to transition are people of color in those industries. And we want to make sure that we are not undermining those economies in our transition to a stronger energy future. And we want to do some, community shared solar, so that a wider variety of tenants and homeowners can take advantage of solar, even if their particular roof is not conducive. There are just so many ways we need to improve our schools, ventilation in our schools, air conditioning in some of our schools, all of the things that we know can help our children have better educational outcomes. So there's so many things. I would advise you to look at the EPA website, where the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council has made over 100 pages of recommendations for how that money can be used in communities. And I think it's eye-opening in many parts of and I won't just talk about Harlem, but many parts of the country still don't have indoor running water. So many parts of the country have not been restored from Hurricane Sandy right here in New York City. So there's just so many ways that we need to have these funds in our communities. And because our communities, and again, we're talking about communities that were redlined, even to get new investment, they need pre-investment to get themselves to the level where you can bring in some of these other green infrastructure benefits. And of course, we need money for innovation and entrepreneurship. We need entrepreneurs who are developing these new energy technologies and who are being supported to do that.
Well, that's a huge assignment.
It is.
We know how urgent all of these changes are, but it's amazing to think about how moving toward a renewable energy-based economy would help us reach the other goal of reducing our climate emissions overall, and the quickly rising temperature. So we've hopefully got some inspiration for doing something to support your work and the policy changes that you've been advocating for and informing us about. I've just shared the We Act policy agenda for 2022 and encourage people to take a look. Now I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Mary Rocco, a professor in urban studies here at Barnard, to close us out with some thoughts.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you so much, Ms. Peggy Shepard. This has been an inspiration. You have given us quite a call to action, and I just hope that my summary does justice. I've been taking notes feverishly for my students Monday morning. They will get the full report. But one thing that you said really stood out to me: do no harm does not mean do nothing. And I think that that is a critical piece of wisdom for this particular moment. You always remind us that the strength and resilience and resistance of communities has a long and important role. And in fact, they have been at the forefront. So many of the assumptions that would otherwise invalidate their role are not hip to the history of the ways in which so many of these communities have actually been leading the way the entire time. This recognition of community resistance to systems of oppression is one of the major contributions of Undesign the Red Line and the exhibition now on view at Barnard, where the history of community resistance is juxtaposed against the narrative of oppression and deprivation from the policy agenda and other systems of oppression. I love the idea of a symphony of allies. It's going to take many stakeholders to come together in this fight. And I believe that the call for truth and reconciliation is a huge part of any reparative work that could be done. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. And without both, we can't move towards restorative practice. I'm also intrigued about the calls for leadership, the idea of a practice of refusal on the parts of planners, policymakers, and leaders when communities are not consulted or when there is disparate harm and projects fail to consider the impacts. As a planner and my discipline is urban planning, I think this is a critical call to action, and that people with experience have always been part of these solutions. The lived experience is what drives them. It is what motivates the action, and they have been incredibly successful. Thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. We really appreciate it. And it's just been such a pleasure to listen to you tonight. I'd like to make one last call for our program tomorrow. Come back and join us. We have two fantastic panels planned. One, Reparations, Remedy the Red Line, which will be presenters from the African American Redress Network, and Under One Roof, Conversations with Community, which will bring together longtime residents of Harlem and Upper Manhattan to talk about their experience living in the neighborhoods where we live, learn, play, worship. Thank you again so much. I wish everyone a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope to see you at the exhibit.
Definitely.